All right. Well, welcome to class 6. We are a little bit more than halfway through, which is pretty exciting. We have today's class and then 3 more that will finish us out. And then we'll do class 10, which will be more of a review of the content and an open discussion. We will have the assessment during that class too, so we'll work on that together and make sure everybody is comfortable with the quick review of what we've been covering. But for today, we're going to start talking about ag water. This is always kind of a big topic because ag water over the last couple of years has undergone a lot of scrutiny, particularly with FSMA. The Produce Safety Rule guidelines around water were first introduced a couple years back, and there was a lot of feedback about the initial set of guidelines. So this subject is one that seems to be constantly changing. We're going to spend some time on the basics of it, and then we will probably be letting you guys know about upcoming changes in the next couple of months because there are some new tools coming out with respect to risk assessments for ag water. But we're going to start with the basic kind of stuff that really doesn't need a lot of massaging and talk about what that is. So first thing today is to talk about some definitions. When we talk about ag water, what we're really referring to is the production water. So what are you using in the field while you're growing your product or whatever your field happens to be, greenhouse, hydroponics, any kind of indoor growing system. Production water is what you are using for your crop. And we're going to talk about why we use that term a little bit later, but it helps to differentiate between the post-harvest water. So this is the second term that you want to know when we're talking about ag water is post-harvest. This refers to any water that's used in harvesting. So once you've harvested, this is water that you're using to rinse your product, dunk your product, ice down, cool your product, even washing your hands. So when we talk about post-harvest water, we're referring specifically to water used for all of those types of tasks. So that's the differentiation. Ag water is what's used on the crop. Post-harvest water used after the crop is grown and it has been harvested and is now being prepared for the next step. The reason that this kind of stuff is important is we really want to pay attention to the requirements around both of these types of water. So ag water, when we talk about it with respect to what's in the harmonized GAP standard, there are a couple different sections that we want to pay attention to and that require some information about the water that you're using in your operation. First thing it's going to ask for is a water system description. That's in section F, the field scope. Then we're going to be looking at a water system risk assessment. That's something that will be incorporated into your overall risk assessment that we'll be doing with you guys if it hasn't happened already over the next couple of weeks. There will be a water management plan developed from this information. So when we understand what your water system looks like and we talk with you about the risks associated with your water, we're going to develop a water management plan, which is essentially just writing down how you are using your water and what goes into that. And then any water or ice that's used in the harvest or post-harvest operation, we're going to mention that too. And again, that's going to be known as that post-harvest water. So a little bit different than the water that you're using for your crop potentially. So when we talk about these things, the first thing that we mentioned was a water system description. And that's going to be sort of a brief summary of what does your water system or your irrigation system look like on the farm. So we're going to identify first, where is your water coming from? What is the source? That might be municipal if you're an urban farm. It might be surface water if you're somewhere out on an ag park, for example. It might even be a well. So these are the first things that we're going to look at. What is your water source? Some farms have 2. You may have a surface water source, for example, in the field, and then your post-harvest water is a municipal hookup. So when we ask that question, that's the information that we're looking for. We're going to talk with you about what fields or areas does that water serve. So where does your water go? Does it supply your whole farm? Does it only supply part? And this kind of ties back into when we talked about maps and locations. So understanding, what are the blocks that you have your crop growing in, understanding how to identify those so that when we write this water description, it's very clear. We're going to identify the water flow. This is just a very simple, typically illustration of which way does the water go. What does your basic piping look like? And then type of irrigation used. This means, are you using drip irrigation? Are you using overhead? Do you have a flood system? Do you have a hydroponic system? Or are you relying just on rainfall? So there's a number of things that this could be referring to, and we're going to be asking you about your particular operation. What is the type of irrigation that you're using? The water system description is generally pretty brief, but it does have to be backed up with something that's illustrating how the water flows on the farm. So you're either going to have to supply a map, a drawing, or photos. Any of those things are fine. And in this case, we're not looking for the Cadillac. It doesn't have to be this beautiful, amazing illustration. Just something very basic will suffice. And so here's an example. You can just go on Google Maps and pull something, or Google Earth, pull something off of that and then draw in. You can see on this one, pretty simple. They put a nice little legend up here so you can see this red or orange line is sort of the ag park boundary. Then we've got in this sort of teal turquoise color, the county water system. We've got two field lines, which are in, it looks like black and blue. So there's the infield line right here, these little black ones. And then this blue line is really looks like the sub-main. So what you want to do with the map is something like this. And then you're going to identify with these yellow arrows, which way does your water flow? So which way is it going? This is just one example using a map. You can also do something drawn out like we're seeing here in this picture. So in this case, they kind of put it all together. This is a homework page, which is giving you a snapshot of what you're going to see later on your homework. And essentially what they did is they just drew pictures or squares or rectangle shapes of their beds. This is an aquaponics system. So we've got aquaponics bed here. We've got some other things over here. And essentially what they did is they just identified by color, municipal water. So where is that? Right here, house and bathrooms got municipal water entry point up here. The yellow is the water pumped from the sump. Where does that go? And then blue, water fed to the sump from the fish tank. So you can see, again, very simple. We don't need it to be really fancy. What you need to really identify here in your illustration or map is, what is the water source? Again, we're looking for, is it municipal? Is it surface? Is it a well? Or is it a combination of these things? It's good to identify the permanent fixtures. So if you've got tanks on your property, a reservoir on your property, a well, backflow preventers, those are things that you just want to identify on the map with, a little X or a little symbol that shows where they are. How does the water move? So general direction of the flow. That's where those arrows came in on the previous map that I showed you. And then if you need to describe it, particularly when it's aquaponics system, whoops, sorry about that, touchy. You're going to want to, going forward, here we go. You're going to want to identify your aquaponics beds or your field blocks. And again, how many backflow preventers are on the site. So just put a little bit of detail into this. Again, it doesn't need to be super down to the minute detailed because things change, but a basic understanding of how your water system works. So once you've completed that water system and we start to work on your farm plan, we're going to look at your water risk assessment to get a little bit more information. This is, again, just like our other categories of animals, ag chemicals, etc. We're looking at what are the potential hazards that are introduced via the water system or that could come into the water system. Some of the things that we're looking at here is, of course, what is your water source, but also what is the crop that you're growing? For example, overhead irrigation, if you've got a crop that needs to be kept cool and you're using overhead irrigation for that purpose, plus to water it, there's a different level of risk there than there is with drip line, particularly when it's buried, right? So what is the potential hazard if the water is touching the edible portion of the crop? So looking at the crop itself and the method of irrigation that you're using is going to be something we're going to talk about in this risk assessment. We're also going to talk about water testing. And this we'll get into more detail shortly here, but essentially, if you're using surface water, you're going to need to have some idea of how contaminated or clean that water might be. So these are things that we'll talk through in the risk assessment. Talk about ways that you are mitigating, what are your control methods for this, and whether or not that water testing is needed. If so, how frequently do you need to do it? So all of this information that we get from you, the water source, kind of a description of how your water system is set up, the map, and then the risk assessment is going to help us create the water management plan, which is one of those requirements in the field scope. What is it? Basically, it's a kind of longer description or policy of how you handle your water and water quality as you are using the water in your ag system. So looking at what are the controls you have in place, is there any monitoring that you need to do? That's where your testing comes in. Verification procedures, again, your testing may be part of that. It also may be related to, like you see in the picture here, chlorine strips. So if you have a system where maybe you are treating your post-harvest water, you're going to have to make sure that that is included in this water management plan as a procedure, and you have identified, for example, my free chlorine needs to be at this range. So those things will go into the water management plan. It may be that your water management plan is very simple. You may be harvesting and not rinsing any of your product. So really, in that case, we're just looking at what is your irrigation water, and then do you have adequate post-harvest water for cleaning tables, hands, and things like that, depending on your situation. So this will be a highly customized piece of your farm food safety plan. Water testing. So this one always comes up as a question. First, the people want to know, do I need to test it? And then how often do I need to test it, and how do I do that? So the first thing to say is that we are going to figure that out with you depending on what your risk assessment says or what your risk assessment tells us and what your water source is. We'll work through this with you. A lot will depend on what your procedure is with respect to both irrigating your crop and also your post-harvest tasks. If you have municipal water and you're using that for post-harvest tasks, you're not going to need to worry about testing that. Those tests are done by the municipality, by the county, and we can access that water quality information. Your irrigation water, though, is often not municipal in nature. And so in that case, we're going to need to know what is the source, and we're going to talk about how often you're going to need to test that, what that baseline and acceptable standard might be. And this is where there's still some information flowing from not only USDA, but also FDA on what the requirements are around water quality. Essentially, what we're looking for, though, is that we can show that the water quality does not present a contamination risk to your crop. So again, municipal water source, you're in good shape. If that's what you're using, all the way through, we're just going to pull a water quality report from the Board of Water Supply. If you're using well or surface water, the short answer is you are going to have to test it or have it tested. And depending on other factors, We're going to talk about how frequently that needs to happen, but the minimum for well sources is once a year, and the surface water is going to be 4 times a year. So surface water in Hawaii is very common. This is going to cover things like open ditch, of course. It may also be that your water comes from a well but sits in a reservoir. In that case, it's considered surface water. If you are capturing water from the roof of a building or buildings on your property, that's also considered surface water. It's running down the surface of your roof, and contaminants can be introduced there. On the mainland, in most places, surface water testing is required 3 times a year, but in warm climates like Florida, Hawaii, maybe some parts of Texas, they're going to require that quarterly. So 4 times a year is the minimum. If this water is going to also be used for post-harvest processes, so if you're rinsing or intending to rinse your product with this surface water, if you're going to be using it to wash hands. This is sometimes happening on farms where there isn't really any other source and the operator doesn't want to bring water to the site. In those cases, you're going to have to treat the water or filter the water to make sure that it becomes microbially clean, which means no detectable E. coli. So these are things to keep in mind if surface water is the only water you have available at the farm. The other option, of course, is to bring clean water for those post-harvest tasks. Municipal water, as I've said, no requirement for you to test this water if the water quality report is available. And so in Hawaii, our Board of Water Supplies by county typically have this information up. It usually gets renewed in July or so. So at that point, one of the services that we provide for you guys is to track that information down and file it in your Heavy Connect binder so that it's there. On Oahu, this water quality information is done by street. So we actually have to input your address of your site into the system to pull that water quality report. On the neighbor islands, Kauai, Hawaii, Maui, that is typically done by region. So as long as we know exactly where your farm is located, then we can pull that information. This is annual, so every year this is one of the pieces of information that we will remember to update for you in your Heavy Connect binder. So we'll take that old one and file it and put the new one in the summertime typically. Microbially safe water is water that doesn't have any detectable E. coli. So that's what we're looking for here. That's okay to use for production and post-harvest. Typically, people are only using it for post-harvest because that would be prohibitively expensive generally to use it to irrigate with. But it does depend on your situation and your operation. Well water, so 2 ways to look at well water. If the well is fully enclosed, which means that it is covered and the water is strictly groundwater, it comes from the well and goes directly out to irrigate without being open, doesn't sit in a reservoir, doesn't flow through a ditch, for example, then you are allowed to test it only once a year. So 1 time a year, you'll grab a sample of your water and send it in for testing. If the well is open, though, which means it's not covered, water is discharged into something that sits in an open environment like a reservoir or a ditch, then it becomes surface water. It's considered surface water. And so you will need to test quarterly in that situation. And these are questions, again, that we'll be asking you when we start to work on your water section. We're going to be asking you, what is your source water? And if you do say well, then we're going to ask a few more questions. Is it open? Is it closed? Does it sit in a reservoir, etc.? So then when we talk about water testing, we start to think about, well, if we test it, what do we need to know then? What's the criteria that's acceptable? So we're going to break this down into acceptable criteria for irrigation water, or what we're calling ag water. And then we're going to talk about acceptable criteria for post-harvest water. The irrigation water criteria is a a little bit fluid, which means essentially that it really depends on the risk assessment that we do with you and the activities that you're doing on the farm. So what this means is that we're really going to break this down with you. What is your crop that's being irrigated? Is the water touching the edible portion of the crop? What is the method of irrigation delivery that you're using? So there's a lot of pieces that go into this. And this is the area, as I mentioned at the beginning, that's been the subject of a lot of feedback with FDA. In the past, up until very recently, the FDA FSMA regulations used the recreational water standard as the criteria. And that was just because they didn't have anything else to go on, basically. So they figured if it was safe enough for people to swim in, this is a good guideline for crops. You can use that if it fits in with what we discuss in your risk assessment, or you can decide that you're going to use a different set of numbers, a different threshold. In Hawaii, we often see that our surface water is contaminated. I've done a lot of water testing over the years across the islands, and I rarely find surface water that looks even close to being clean. But it does fluctuate by season. Typically in the summertime, the total coliform and E. coli load is much lower until we have a heavy rain event, and then it spikes quite a bit. So getting a sense of your water just by doing those at least quarterly testing is really important because it does give you some information. Otherwise, you're kind of working blindly. So we'll talk about this again with each of you in more detail because it is going to be customized to your own operation. And we will be, over the next couple of months, also probably getting a new tool to do this assessment. So as we work through this, we may revisit it with you maybe not this year, but the following year for sure. The recreational water standard, there's two ways that this is looked at. So the first is the geometric mean. That is taking 5 samples and calculating the mean. And the mean of those samples must be less than or equal to 126 CFUs per 100 mil sample. CFU stands for colony forming unit. No single sample can be more than 235 CFUs per 100 mils. So that is one of the ways that we look at the water quality per the recreational water standard. There's also what is called the STV, or statistical threshold value. This measures the generic E. coli load in the water. We want to see that at 410 CFUs or less in 100 mils. When we do this with you, we typically look at, of course, one sample at a time, and then we can calculate the mean after we've gotten a couple samples together. But generally, because we have these single sample data points, we can tell kind of where this is going to fall. I generally recommend that if you are going to be sampling your water, surface water, get a sense of, in the first year, what does it typically look like? If you sample right after a heavy rain event, you might want to think about doing a second sample after things settle down, because that sample taken during that heavy rain event is going to be loaded with contaminants. And so it does show you kind of a spike. Good to know, though, this is another reason why noting down some of the information, such as flooding or heavy rain events, on your dangerous incidents log is really important, because you can go back then and say, oh, I had this really high water quality sample when it rained really heavily. So it is something that happens. It is maybe not the norm. Then we want to touch on the California leafy greens market standards. The California leafy greens market standards came out of a really devastating foodborne illness event many years ago now. It's 2025. And so they developed their own set of standards particular to leafy greens. I'm just going to leave this up here for you guys. We don't typically use this unless in specificity anyway, unless you are required to do so because your buyer asked you to use it. Currently, I don't know of any buyers in Hawaii who are asking their growers to follow this standard. As you can see, it's very similar to the recreational water standard, slightly different in the single sample data points, but otherwise the threshold values are very similar. However, we did hear from colleagues on the mainland that Whole Foods Market is moving towards requiring this standard for water quality. I don't know if any of you guys are selling or plan to sell to Whole Foods. We do have a question out to our contact at Whole Foods to ask if this is, if that was accurate information, and if so, if this is something that they will be starting to require for Hawaii growers. So we'll keep you posted on that. If you are planning to sell to Whole Foods, just file it away for yourself. If you have a contact there, it might be good to ask them about this. And again, it only applies to leafy greens currently. So if there's another product that you're selling to Whole Foods, it's good to ask, but you probably don't need to worry about it yet. All right, so next thing we're going to talk about is when you get your water tested, how do you do that? So when we look at what the harmonized GAP standard requires, it is very specific. And this is one area where the USDA harmonized GAP standard is more robust than what the FSMA PSR requirements are. And that's because the harmonized GAP standard requires that you have your water tested in a lab that has either GLP status, which stands for good laboratory status, or that has a proficiency testing program. So this is something that's not required if all you need to do is be FSMA compliant. But when you're working on your USDA certification, there's this added layer of robustness. Luckily, in Hawaii, we have a couple of labs that we can go to for water testing, and they all have one of these two things, either proficiency testing or GLP status. When you get your water sample back, if it's considered microbially safe, this is for post-harvest water, you can use it for any of your post-harvest activities. So this means there's no generic E. coli detected. You can use that water for hand washing, cleaning, rinsing your product. If the water is contaminated, so if your generic E. coli number is above 0, then you don't want to use that for post-harvest activities. That is against the law, actually. It's a Hawaii revised statute, and you must treat it. There are a couple different ways to do this. So if you are using water that's, for example, not municipal, or you have, for some reason, water that is municipal but is contaminated, you can add a sanitizing agent to your post-harvest water to bring it up to that microbially safe standard. This is something we would include in your plan. So why is that the case? What are you using? And a testing schedule to make sure that the sanitizer is effective. So pretty simple to do. It can be done. We've done it before. So just keep that in mind. Also, on that note, if you are using a sanitizer to clean your water and bring it up to that standard, this has to be an approved and effective method. That means that you have to do it according to what the label says. You need to make sure that that is actually listed on the label, that you can use that sanitizer for water to bring it up to that microbially clean standard. And then occasionally you're going to need to check that it's working. So again, this is a log that you're going to have to keep, going to document this information, and we're going to have a testing schedule that we come up with. We can help you with that. We'll write that into your farm plan, and that's something that will create a log for you to use as well. Okay, I'm going to stop for just a second. Are there any questions on any of this? You guys can put it in the chat or unmute yourself. This is a lot of information about water that typically generates some confusion. Okay, I don't see anything coming up yet. If you do have a question, though, and you don't want to speak it up right now, go ahead and put it in the chat. You can also email us if something comes up later, so don't hesitate to ask. I'm going to move on, though, into aquaponics overview here because this is becoming a more common type of operation. And luckily, USDA does have standards for aquaponics. I guess probably about 5 years ago or so, they introduced an aquaponics GAP pilot program. So it was an opportunity to test it out, try to see, does it work? What are the standards that they required, and are they things that farmers had any feedback on or could meet? We participated in that, had a couple of operations in Hawaii that were part of that pilot program. And I want to say about 2 or 3 years after that, they made it a regular harmonized GAP or a regular GAP standard. So it is no longer a pilot. This is how we deal with GAP for aquaponic systems. First thing, plants and fish have to be separated, so cannot be in the same tank. Water that's moving between the fish and where you're growing your crop must be filtered at a minimum to remove solids. So we want to keep that fish waste separate from your crop. If the water that is moving between your crop tank and your fish tank might contact the edible portion of the crop, the water must undergo sanitation. This one typically causes a lot of issue at first, but when we think about most aquaponic systems, the fact that the crop is up on a floating bed means that it is not that likely that the fish or that the water is going to contact the edible portion of the crop. What we'll do if this is your system, an aquaponic system, is we'll talk with you about what are your procedures if that does happen. So let's say something catastrophic happens and half your bed goes down into the water. What are you going to do? So simple to deal with generally, but just keep that in mind. Monthly water testing is required. This is the big one for aquaponics GAP. So the water testing is ramped up quite a bit here. You need to take your sample after the fish tanks, so as it's moving towards your crop. And the last thing for this that's a little bit of a difference between other types of systems and aquaponic systems, you're going to need a couple additional SOPs that are really focused on cross-contamination. So one of the things that we're going to ask you about in this scenario when we talk about how are you handling your operation and your post-harvest, how do you segregate or sanitize your tools and equipment? So what's being used on the fish side versus the crop side? How do employees prevent cross-contamination by themselves? So how do they move, just like with animals on the farm? Are you going to go from animals to crop or crop to animals? How to prevent the edible portion of the crop from contacting water during harvest. So this is typically, you're keeping these things up on some kind of floating system. Are there any other methods or procedures that you're using to prevent water from getting onto your crop as you're harvesting or doing any other tasks? So just a quick little overview. Some things here a little bit different. Main thing is the monthly water testing is required. So when you go to work on your certification and we're getting ready for your internal audit, we're going to be looking to see, if you're an aquaponics operation, how many water tests do you have? From this point forward, we're going to start thinking about, okay, you should have a test at least for April, May, June, July. Let's say we're doing your internal audit in August. So you should have a handful of tests already done. So you're going to want to start to work on that if an aquaponics operation is what you're doing. Brief little bit about E. coli. I've mentioned this already a few times, but we wanted to take a moment just to talk about it so everyone understands exactly what we mean. Generic E. coli, and specifically we're talking about generic E. coli. There are a lot of different types of or strains of E. coli. When we talk about water quality, we are just talking about generic E. coli. It is an indicator of fecal contamination. So it just means that if you find generic E. coli in your water sample, it's possible that there has been contamination by fecal matter. In FSMA, generic E. coli is the required water quality indicator. You have to use that. You can't try to do your water quality sample with something else. It is a type of coliform. Coliforms are bacteria that are found naturally in the environment, in soil. and they are found in the intestines of warm-blooded animals. We all shed them. And so that's why it's such an important indicator in Hawaii in particular, because as we know, our watersheds are full of animals, maybe some that shouldn't be there like cats, but we have lots of things roaming around shedding into our water. So when you have your water sample sent to the lab and you get it back, your results are going to show you probably two things: total coliforms and then your generic E. coli count. Your total coliforms are almost always going to be high. And that is because total coliforms are a huge group of bacteria. We already know that they're present in the soil. There isn't very much we can do about that. They're naturally occurring. So that number is never going to be zero. The generic E. coli number, though, may fluctuate. So that's the one you need to pay attention to. Again, water that you're using for post-harvest tests, you don't want to see any generic E. coli. That should be zero. It's actually going to say less than or equal to zero, because they'll never give you a straight up zero. Generic E. coli is really considered the most accurate indication of whether there was fecal matter in the water or not. And so we rely on that number versus the total coliforms number. The total coliforms number is just a whole bunch of different types of bacteria, not just one. So to kind of recap this, we want to talk a little bit about production water or ag water. What are we looking at when we think about the risk? So when we sit down with you guys and we talk about your risk assessment, we're really trying to start thinking about, could pathogens be introduced to your water source and potentially contaminate your product? And if so, how does that happen? How could that happen? We're going to evaluate that by looking at the water source and quality. So surface water, as an example, it's high risk, right? It's an open ditch system. Whenever there's rain, you're going to have overland water running into that ditch. You don't have any control of who's dumping things into the ditch up above you. So there's a lot of potential contamination that could happen with surface water. Other examples of where potential contamination could come, if you have, for example, pipes across your property. When a pipe breaks, depending on where it breaks, there's a potential contamination risk there. So maybe you have lay flats that people are driving over. They start to get some wear and tear. They break open. Now you've got something coming potentially into your pipe and getting introduced to your product or your crop. We're going to talk about the application method and the timing. So this is important, again, because, for example, drip tape is going to be a lot less potential contamination than overhead. So how you're applying your water to your crop is going to play into this level of assessment. And when are you irrigating? If you are an operation that has a crop that maybe you cut the irrigation off at a certain point in time and the crop continues to grow for a few weeks without any water, there's a little bit less of a concern in those last couple of weeks because you're not introducing water to your crop at all. So kind of the general mind or thinking that you want to have with this is that the less contact that your water has with the product, the less risk there is. So again, overhead is the highest level. We're putting water right down on top the edible portion of the crop. Then we've got drip down there at the bottom. Sometimes that drip tape is even buried. So there's really very little chance, except for a leak, that water is going to contact the edible portion of the crop, unless it's a root crop. So keeping those things in mind, this is how we're going to walk through this water risk assessment with you guys. So when we do have issues, one of the things that we're going to identify, just like the other sections of our risk assessment, animals, soil, pests, pesticides, et cetera, we're going to talk about how are we dealing with these potential risks? How are we mitigating them? So there's a couple things that can be done with production water or ag water. First thing is extending the time between the application and the harvest. So again, if we are not harvesting right after we watered, then the level of contamination or level of risk is a little bit lower. The other piece to think about here is how can the pathogens be killed off or be reduced? And if you think back to our first class, we talked about the things that pathogens need to survive, right? They need water, they need food, and they need some perfect temperature that they exist in. So if we can change those a little bit, we have the potential to reduce them or kill them off. So first thing we can take away, the water, right? We dry it out, then they don't have one of those three things that they need to survive. Exposure to the sun, not only does this increase temperature, but also UV radiation, which may be effective in killing pathogens. Temperature, humidity, again, we take our product and we cool it down as quickly as possible, get it into a dry environment. That's going to help us reduce that pathogen load. So we want to just really try to keep those three key things that pathogens want to have in mind and start to play around with those to reduce it. However, sometimes we can't do that. And sometimes pathogens just have evolved to have a lot of survivability. So they can live for a long time, even when you try to take away one of those three things that they need to have. So we just want to make sure that we're preventing as much as possible. And again, keeping in mind, what are the potential contaminants? If it's fecal matter from pigs, then do we have an adequate procedure in place to try to keep the pigs off of our farm? All these things can play into the prevention mindset. When we talk about post-harvest water, we're going to be asking you about water and if you use ice. Both of these things are considered post-harvest water sources. So any water that you're using when you're harvesting to clean equipment, to clean your product, clean your hands, and post-harvest, your after-harvest, after-packing cleaning tasks, that water must be microbially clean. So again, 0 detectable E. coli. This is verified by thinking through your water use procedures. So is water touching food contact surfaces? Is water or ice used when you're rinsing your product? Maybe you're making an ice bath. Maybe you're just putting ice up on top of your product after it's in some kind of container. So we really need to check on those procedures and make sure that that water is clean. Again, water can be treated to meet this standard, to meet the microbially clean standard, or to prevent cross-contamination. So for example, if you're using a bath to rinse your product and you are not letting the water run through and right back out the sink, if you are actually stopping up the sink and you're putting multiple batches of product in there to rinse it, in this case, you want to prevent cross-contamination. So you can add a sanitizer to your water to do that. Again, anytime we use these types of products, we got to make sure that it's labeled for that purpose and that we're following the label instructions. So 2 big things there, kind of repetitive to what we've talked about with any kind of ag chemical use, but just bears repeating. So how do we know that our water system is not introducing any additional contamination? One of the things that we want to look at and that the standard requires is an assessment of the water delivery system. This is different than the risk assessment. This is really a look at your actual piping and water delivery mechanisms to make sure that things are not broken, leaking, have rust, or any other potential contamination introduced to the system. This is something that you get to decide how often you want to do. You're going to complete this based on the schedule that you determine is sufficient. So this is, again, part of the risk assessment is thinking about, well, how much risk is there in your operation and how often do you then need to go look at your system? You want to make sure that basically what you're doing is meeting the requirement here, which is that the delivery system is maintained, right? So we want to make sure that we are keeping up on any type of infrastructure maintenance that needs to happen to ensure that our water system is as much contamination is reduced as is possible. And then you also want to make sure if you have a system or an operation where you have a backflow preventer, you are supposed to have that tested annually. And this is to make sure that if you're using fertigation or chemigation practices, it doesn't back up into any kind of public system. So if that's applicable, if you do have backflow preventers on your farm, we're going to want to make sure that you have some documentation of an annual test. Oftentimes, we have found that folks who are leasing land, there's some kind of agreement with the leaseholder to do that. If you're in an urban setting, typically if you're renting or leasing space, they're going to take care of it. But this is something to start thinking about. Look to see if you have a backflow preventer if you don't know, and then figure out how can we get that documentation to show that it has had an annual test. When we talk about this assessment too, and we have this section written out in your farm plan, in addition to saying how often you're going to go look at your system, we're also going to describe what your produce washing process is, what procedures that you have around that, how do you prepare for it, and then what happens step by step. And we're also going to include information on your water quality, if there's any sanitizers, and if there's any wash water temperature requirements. This typically doesn't happen, but is commodity specific. So if you are growing something like tomatoes or melons, those are products that are known to suck in water if you dunk them, and they are really warm and the water is really cool. We want to avoid that because we don't want any contamination to get sucked into the plant from that water that they're getting dunked in. So that's what your wash water temperature requirement is referring to there. Again, this is something we'll talk about with you individually as we work through what your commodities are that you're growing. So that is it. It's a lot. It's a big information dump. Really quickly, I'm going to go through the homework and then we'll have some time to discuss. But first thing we're going to ask you to do this time around is create your water system map and description. So this can be one page with your map and a short description written on there. The key things you want to capture is what's your source water? Are there any backflow preventers on your property? And if so, can you put them on the map? Do you know where they are? And what direction does your water flow? Obviously, you're going to want to draw in aquaponics beds or field blocks or, your growing structure so that we can get a sense of, how many, for example, blocks or beds or racks is your irrigation system servicing. So just a short description there. And again, the map doesn't have to be anything fancy. You can draw something online using the computer system. You can pull a Google map off of Google Earth or something and draw it in by hand, whatever works for you. You're going to complete the water delivery system assessment on Heavy Connect. This is a log. And again, this is kind of just a walkthrough of your system. What does it look like? So if you go into Heavy Connect, you're going to see it's just about 3 pages of questions, very simple. You're going to identify whether or not there's any broken pipes, any leaking that you see, any rust, anything like that. Very, very simple. It's in the field section. So if you go on Heavy Connect, you're going to click to the field scope section, click the little green button that's a plus, and then you're going to scroll to the water delivery system log. You can do this initially just to get a sense of how it works and get a sense of what your system looks like now. When you do your risk assessment with your farm lead, you're going to determine how frequently you're going to do that log. Whatever you say, we're going to put in your farm plan, and that's how many logs we're going to be looking for when we do your internal audit. So typically, farms will choose maybe a every 6 months assessment. So you're looking at your whole system at least twice a year, getting a really good sense of what it looks like. That does depend on the operation, though. So you're going to work through that with your farm lead. And then if applicable, which for most folks, it is probably going to be applicable. If you're only on municipal water, you can skip number 3. But if you're on surface water, well water, or some other system, we're going to help you set up your water sampling and testing schedule, and we're going to get you ready to send your first sample out. We do have a list of labs that we work with, and we have arranged with almost all of them for a discount for GroupGAP. So we will give you the information on how to let them know that you are in the GroupGAP program and the steps that you need to follow to take that test, and then where you're going to send it. 2 of the labs are on Oahu, so you can choose to either drop it off or mail it, or drop it in. The other lab is on Hawaii Island, and that one, you're obviously, if you're not on Hawaii Island, you're going to have to mail it. Keep your water quality test receipts, because when USDA offers the food safety reimbursement, if you reach certification, you can get reimbursed for up to 5 tests. So keep your receipts somewhere. You can send them to us. We'll file them in Heavy Connect so you know where they are. But that's a really good little tidbit. You want to get reimbursed for those costs if you can. Okay, I think that's it. I'm going to stop sharing and let's see if there's any questions, because that was like a truckload of things. It can't be that easy, really? I think there might be a question, but I'm having trouble hearing you. Maybe try put it in the chat.
No, I was gonna say it's not that easy, but it's hard to come up with questions right now.
I know it's one of those things you might have to digest a little bit.
Yeah, I think as we look at it, maybe we'll come up with questions, but yeah, not right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, anything you guys think of, anything that you're ruminating on later and you're like, that wasn't really that clear, let us know. You can email me. You can email, thanks, Tim. You can email Ingrid, anybody from the team. We will get you the information on the labs once we have your sampling schedule set up so that you know how often you need to take your samples, and connect you, depending on which lab you want to work with. We'll connect them with you to make sure that they know that you're in GroupGAP, so that you can receive that discount. They're not a huge discount, but it's a couple of dollars off each of your test costs. So hopefully it will help a little bit. All right. Well, if that's it, no questions. I won't hold you guys up any longer, but we will see you next week for class 7. We are getting down to the end. When we get to class 10, we're going to do an assessment. So we want to get a sense of how well this information was delivered and received. So keep in mind 3 or 4 more classes, really, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Everything will be available on the Google Classroom too in a little bit. So we'll put this recording up there a little bit later today. Thanks, guys. Have a good one. Enjoy your spring break.